The smell of floor wax and stale rainy day coats always had a peculiar way of making my heart do a little somersault, even years after I'd traded my school blazer for a sensible woolen trench coat. I stood in the doorway of classroom for be at St. Jude's Academy, watching the dust motes dance in the late afternoon sun. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays are the most honest of days, I think. They don't have the fresh-faced ambition of a Monday or the desperate, frantic joy of a Friday. They're sturdy, a bit grey, like a digestive biscuit without the chocolate coating. I shouldn't have been there, really. The school was due for a massive refurbishment, and the old wing was supposed to be off-limits. But the site foreman was a man named Arthur who liked my mother's lemon drizzle cake and had a soft spot for nostalgic lunatics. As he called me, he'd let me in for 10 minutes to say goodbye to my youth. I walked towards the back of the room, my boots clicking against the parquet floor. There it was, 3rd row from the window, 2nd from the back. The desk with the slightly shorter left leg that made it wobble like a nervous toddler every time you tried to write an essay on the Industrial Revolution. I sat down. My knees hit the underside of the wood. I was much taller now, of course, but the fit felt right in a way that my designer office chair never did. I reached my hand into the dark, narrow crevice beneath the desk surface. My fingers brushed against dried chewing gum vial. Really, when you think about the archaeology of it, and then something thin and crisp. A piece of paper. I pulled it out, my breath hitching in my throat. It was yellowed at the edges, folded into a tiny, intricate square. My heart hammered against my ribs like a bird in a showbox. This was it. The last secret. 14 is a very difficult age to be. You are essentially a collection of limbs that don't quite know where they end and the rest of the world begins. I was Eleanor Thorne to my friends, Thorne in my side to Mr. Henderson, the geography teacher. I was a girl who wore her hair into braided plaits that never stayed even and who firmly believed that if I stared at a boy hard enough, he would eventually sense my soul and offer me half of his kit. The boy was Alistair Vance. Alistair was the sort of boy who always had ink stains on his thumb and a look in his eyes like he was trying to solve a very complicated puzzle involving ghosts and gravity. He was quiet, but not the brooding, mysterious type of quiet you read about in novels. He was just Alistair. He liked to draw maps of places that didn't exist. We shared the desk. I had it for period 2 geography. He had it for period 5 history. We never spoke in the corridors. That would have been too much, too loud, too real. Instead, we lived in the shadows of the wood. It started with a doodle. I had been particularly bored during a lecture on tectonic plates. I found myself drawing a tiny, disgruntled hedgehog in the bottom right corner of the desk's underside using a smuggled biro. Beneath it, I wrote, "This hedgehog thinks the Earth's crust is too crunchy." The next day, when I slid into my seat, I reached under to see if I'd left any crumbs from my morning scone. My fingers found a new texture. A small scrap of paper was tucked into the join of the wood. "The hedgehog is right," the note said in tiny, cramped handwriting. "But he should be careful. If the plates move too much, he'll lose his tea." I nearly fell off my chair. It was a reply from the void door, more accurately, from whoever sat here after lunch. I checked the timetable pinned to the wall. Alistair Vance. The boy who looked like he knew where the ghosts lived. From that day on, the desk became our post office. We didn't exchange names at first, we exchanged philosophies. Ellie, I would write eventually giving in to the need for identity. Do you think the clouds know they are being watched, or are they just shy? Alistair replied, I think clouds are actually the sky's way of thinking. White clouds are happy thoughts. Grey ones are when the sky is trying to remember where it put its keys. And thunderstorms, that's just the sky stubbing its toe on a mountain. It was deep, it was meaningful, it was, in retrospect, Absolutely ridiculous, but to a 14-year-old girl with a penchant for romanticism, it was the most profound thing I had ever read. I felt as though Alistair and I were two explorers on different sides of the same mountain, communicating through echoes. Life is like a ham sandwich, I once told him. Sometimes it's a bit dry, and the crusts are hard, but if you find a bit of mustard in the middle, it makes the whole thing worth it. Alistair replied, I don't like mustard. I think life is more like a library book. Someone else has always read it before you, and they've probably left a sticky fingerprint on page 42. But the story is still yours to finish. He was so wise, or at least, he used words that sounded like they belonged in a black and white film. One Tuesday in November, a particularly grey, stubborn Tuesday, I decided to be brave. Being brave is very exhausting. It involves a lot of sweating and wondering if you should have just stayed in bed with a book. I wrote a note that didn't talk about clouds or sandwiches. Alistair, I'm wearing a yellow ribbon in my hair today, just in case you wanted to know what colour my thoughts are. I waited all day. My heart was a drum kit. When school ended, I lingered by the gates, watching the sea of navy blue blazers pour out. I saw him, Alistair. He was walking with his bag slung over one shoulder, looking at the ground as if he were trying to count the pavement cracks. He stopped, he looked up, his eyes scanned the crowd and landed on me. I froze, the yellow ribbon felt like a neon sign, screaming, look at me, I am fragile and possibly insane. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, he just stood there for a second, tucked a stray hair behind his ear, and then gave a very small, very deliberate nod. It was as if he were acknowledging a fellow secret agent. Then he turned and walked towards the bus stop. I went home and cried into my pillow, because it was the most romantic thing that had ever happened in the history of the world. The notes continued for months. We talked about everything and nothing. We discussed the tragedy of dropped ice cream and the way the school bells sounded like they were mourning the loss of the weekend. We never spoke in person. To speak would have been to break the spell. The desk was a sanctuary. Beneath that lid, we were infinite. Above it, we were just two awkward teenagers trying to pass maths. But then, the great erasure happened. It was a Monday morning. I arrived at geography, ready to retrieve Alistair's thoughts on the existential dread of Sunday evenings. I reached under the desk. Nothing. I felt around frantically. My fingers hit clean, smooth wood. I looked down. The entire underside of the desk had been scrubbed. The hedgehog was gone. The ink stains were gone. The school had hired a particularly aggressive cleaning crew over the weekend. I felt a hollow ache in my chest. It was as if a library had burned down, and I was the only person who remembered the books. That day, I didn't leave a note. I was too heartbroken. I figured Alistair would feel the same. We had lost our world. But on Tuesday, I found a single piece of paper taped to the very back of the desk's leg, hidden in the shadows where a sponge couldn't reach. They cleaned the desk, it said, but they can't clean the air. I'm still here, Ellie. Don't be sad. The desk is just a piece of a tree. We are the ones who make it talk. I smiled so hard my cheeks ached. I realized then that Alistair wasn't just a boy with ink on his thumbs. He was a poet of the mundane. He taught me that even if the world tries to wipe you away with soapy water and a stiff brush, you can always find a corner to hide in. However, the end of the year was approaching. Year 11 loomed. Different buildings, different schedules. The geography room was being repurposed for Year 7 South. Our time at the wobbly desk was coming to a close. On the final day of term, I wrote him a long letter. It wasn't about clouds or sandwiches. It was a thank you. Thank you for being the person who listened to the silent parts of me. I told him I would be by the old oak tree in the park at 4 p.m. If he wanted to turn the library book to the next chapter, he could meet me there. I tucked the note deep into the crevice. I waited under that oak tree until the sun began to dip behind the hills, turning the sky the color of a bruised peach. He never came. I walked home that day feeling like a balloon that had lost all its helium. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that some stories are meant to be short stories, not novels. I told myself that Alistair Vance was probably just a figment of my imagination made of ink and paper. I moved away to months later. My father got a job in Manchester, and St. Jude's Academy became a memory tucked into the back of my mind, like a pressed flower in a heavy book. And now, here I was, 10 years later. I sat in the dusty silence of classroom for B, the yellowed square of paper in my hand. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. Was this my note, the one I'd left for him? Had he never found it? I opened the paper. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was tiny, cramped, and looked like it had been written by someone whose heart was beating very fast. Dear Ellie, it began. I found your note about the oak tree, but I found it too late. I came back to the desk on the last day, after everyone had gone, because I wanted to leave you something. I found your letter, but by then it was 6 p.m. I went to the park, but you were gone. I waited there until it got dark, hoping you'd forgotten your glove or something and would come back for it. I'm leaving this here now, even though I know the school is closing this wing for the summer. Maybe you'll come back one day. Maybe you won't. I just wanted you to know that the hedgehog survived. I drew him again, right in the corner where the wood meets the metal. You have to look really closely. You asked once if the clouds know they're being watched. I don't know about the clouds, but I know I was watching, and you are the brightest yellow ribbon in a very grey world. I'm going to go now. I have to go and learn how to be a person who speaks out loud instead of just writing on wood. It's going to be terrifying. Yours, Alistair. I felt a hot, prickling sensation in my eyes. A tear escaped and landed on the paper, blooming into a small damp circle. I looked at the corner of the desk, right where the wood met the metal frame. I leaned down, squinting through the dim light. There, faint and almost worn away by time, was a tiny, disgruntled hedgehog. I laughed. It was a wet, shaky sound that echoed in the empty classroom. How ridiculous we were. How beautifully, wonderfully absurd. We had spent a year communicating through a piece of furniture, and we had both missed the chance to say hello because we were too busy being deep. I stood up, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. I felt a strange sense of lightness. The missed connection of my youth wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a gift. It was proof that once upon a time, two people had managed to build a bridge out of nothing but ink and imagination. I tucked Alistair's note into my pocket. I wouldn't leave one back. The desk had done its job. It was time for it to be turned into sawdust, or whatever happens to old school desks when the world moves on. I walked out of the classroom and found Arthur, the foreman, leaning against the corridor wall, checking his watch. Found what you were looking for? Then he asked, his voice booming in the quiet hall. Yes, I said, smiling at him. I found out that the sky doesn't actually lose its keys. It just likes to keep us guessing. Arthur blinked at me, looking genuinely concerned for my mental health. Right, well, as long as you're happy, love, best get going. The lads are coming in with the sledgehammers in 10 minutes. I nodded and walked towards the main exit. As I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the sun was shining. It wasn't a Tuesday anymore, it was a Thursday. Thursdays are full of potential. They are the threshold of the weekend. I started walking towards the town centre, my mind drifting to the present. I had a job I liked, a flat with too many plants, and a life that was mostly mustard and very little dry crust. But as I passed a small, independent coffee shop, I saw something that made me stop dead. There, sitting at a small table by the window, was a man. He had a laptop in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was staring out at the street, watching the people go by. He had a look in his eyes like he was trying to solve a very complicated puzzle involving ghosts and gravity, and on his right thumb there was a faint, unmistakable smudge of blue ink. My heart didn't do a somersault this time. It did a full-blown Olympic floor routine. I took a breath. I straightened my trench coat. I thought about the hedgehog. I thought about the library book with the sticky fingerprint on page 42. I walked to the door of the coffee shop. I didn't wait for a sign. I didn't write a note. I didn't wonder if the clouds were shy. I walked straight up to his table. He looked up, his eyes widening in a way that suggested he was seeing a ghost he had spent 10 years trying to map. "Alistair," I said. My voice was steady. It was a grown-up voice. He stared at me for a long beat. Then, a slow, hesitant smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that looks like the sun finally finding its way through a thick layer of grey clouds. "Ellie," he whispered. He looked at my hair. You aren't wearing a yellow ribbon." "No," I said, pulling a chair out and sitting down without being asked. I decided that if you wanted to know what colour my thoughts were, you just have to ask me. He laughed then, a rich, warm sound that was much better than any echo. He closed his laptop and leaned forward. "So," he said, his eyes bright with a decade's worth of unspoken notes, "what colour are they?" Today, I glanced out the window at the bright, clear sky. Today, they're exactly the colour of a new chapter. We sat there for hours. We didn't talk about tectonic plates or the Industrial Revolution. We talked about the people we had become, the messy, complicated, wonderful adults who had grown out of the cracks in that old wooden desk. Life, I realized, isn't actually like a ham sandwich or a library book. It's more like a blank sheet of paper. It's terrifying because it's empty, but it's beautiful because you get to choose exactly what to write on it. And as we walked out of the coffee shop together, stepping into the golden glow of the evening, I knew one thing for certain. The hedgehog would be proud. The evening air in Oakhaven didn't just sit there, it swirled around us like a gossamer scarf made of wood smoke and the scent of damp pavement. It was that peculiar time of day when the world seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the moon to decide if it's actually going to turn up or if it's too tired to perform. Alistair walked beside me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a charcoal wool coat that looked far too sensible for the boy who used to write about the existential dread of a pencil sharpener. We walked in a silence that wasn't heavy, but rather quite buoyant, like a well-baked Victoria sponge. It was the sort of silence you only get when two people have already said everything that mattered in a cramped coffee shop and are now just letting the reality of each other's presence sink in. "You've grown," he said suddenly, looking at me sideways. We were passing the old clock tower, the one that had been stuck at 4:12 since the great storm of 1987. "Usually happens," I replied, kicking a stray pebble. "Biology is very insistent on that sort of thing. I stopped at 5'4", though I think my height decided that anything more would just be showing off." Alistair chuckled, and the sound felt like a warm radiator in a drafty room. "I meant, you've grown into your eyes. At 16, they always looked like they were trying to see through people, or perhaps through time itself. Now, they just look like they're glad to be here." I felt a flush creep up my neck. I wasn't used to people noticing my eyes as anything other than a delivery system for contact lenses. I think at 16, I was trying to be a protagonist in a Russian novel, I admitted. I thought being miserable was the only way to prove I was thinking. If I wasn't slightly tragic, was I even alive? It's a very exhausting way to live. "Alistair, I don't recommend it. It requires far too much black eyeliner and sighing." I was the same, he said, pausing by a black iron railing that overlooked the canal. The water below was dark and oily, reflecting the first few orange street lamps. "I spent 3 months trying to write a poem about the loneliness of a digestive biscuit. I thought if I could capture the sadness of being dipped into tea, I would finally understand the human condition." "And did you?" "No," he grinned. "I just ended up with a lot of soggy crumbs and a very confused mother. She thought I was having a breakdown. I told her I was ascending. She told me to go mow the lawn." We leaned against the railing, the cold metal biting through my sleeves. It felt grounding. For 10 years, this man had been a ghost made of ink and paper. He had been a series of scratches under a desk, a voice in my head that I'd shaped to fit my own loneliness. Seeing him now, with his slightly crooked nose and the way he worried the edge of his sleeve with his thumb, was like seeing a character step out of a book and ask for the time. It was jarring, but also deeply satisfying, like finding the missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle under the sofa, the one you'd given up on years ago. "Why didn't you ever try to find me?" I asked. The question popped out before I could censor it. It was the kind of question that usually ruins a perfectly good walk, but tonight it felt like it belonged. Alistair sighed, a long, misty cloud in the cool air. "I did, sort of. I went back to the school once, about 5 years ago. I thought maybe I'd see you in the corridors. Or maybe you'd be one of those people who never leaves their hometown. But the school felt small, and I realized that if I found you then, I wouldn't know what to say. I was still trying to be the boy from the desk. I hadn't figured out how to be a man yet. I was afraid that if we met, the magic of the notes would vanish. And we'd just be two strangers with nothing in common but a shared piece of furniture. And he turned to face me fully. The light from a nearby shop window caught the smudge of ink on his thumb. "Now I think I've realized that magic is rubbish, or rather, the mysterious kind of magic is. Real magic is sitting in a cafe and finding out that the girl who used to write about tectonic plates now has too many plants in her flat. Real magic is the fact that we're both here, at the same time, in a world that is very good at keeping people apart." I looked down at my boots. "I thought the sky had lost its keys today, Alistair. I really did. I went to the school because they're tearing it down. I thought if I could just touch that desk one last time, I could say goodbye to the version of me that was waiting for something to happen. I didn't think the something would be you sitting in a Nero's with an ink-stained thumb." "I was drawing," he said, pulling a small, battered sketchbook from his bag. He flipped it open. It wasn't full of grand designs or architectural plans. It was full of people. People waiting for buses, people eating sandwiches, a cat sitting on a bean with an air of immense regal authority. "I like to capture the bits of life that no one notices," he whispered. "The bits that are mustard, as you put it. Everyone wants the steak and the wine, but life is mostly the condiment, isn't it? It's the sharp, tangy bits that make the rest of it bearable." I looked at a sketch of an elderly woman holding a very small dog. He'd captured the way her hand rested on the dog's head, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated love. "You're still deep, Alistair," I teased, though my chest felt tight. "You've just swapped the existential biscuits for sketchbooks." "It's a more productive form of madness," he agreed. We started walking again, heading towards the park. The grass was silvered with a light frost, crunching beneath our feet. I thought about the hedgehog again, the one from the desk. "Do you remember the hedgehog?" I asked. Alistair stopped dead. He looked at me, a slow, wide smile breaking across his face. "The one who lived in the teapot, the one who was afraid of spoons." "The very same," I laughed. "I used to worry about him. I used to wonder if he ever found a spoon-free zone." "He did," Alistair said softly. In my head, he moved to a coastal town and opened a small shop selling very small hats. He's quite successful now. He has a seaside villa made of a discarded boot. "That's a very happy ending for a hedgehog," I said, feeling a tear prick at the corner of my eye. It was a stupid thing to get emotional about, but it wasn't about the hedgehog. It was about the fact that he remembered. He had carried my silly, nonsensical stories with him for a decade, just as I had carried his. We reached the bandstand in the center of the park. It was a Victorian relic, painted white and green, looking slightly lonely in the dark. We climbed the steps and sat on the wooden bench inside, sheltered from the rising wind. "I think," I said, looking out at the dark trees, "that we spend a lot of time waiting for life to start. We think there's a finish line. Or a big reveal, like a play where the curtains finally open and everyone starts singing. But it's not like that, is it? It's just a series of Thursdays and ink smudges and old desks. Philosophy again, Ellie. Alistair leaned back, his head resting against the wooden pillar. Fake philosophy, I corrected him. The kind that sounds deep until you actually think about it. Like saying a shoe is just a suitcase for a foot. It sounds profound for 3 seconds, and then you realize it's just nonsense. A suitcase for a foot, Alistair repeated, weighing the words. I like it. It implies that our feet are going on a journey, even if they're just going to the co-op for a pint of milk. Exactly, we're all just tourists in our own lives, Alistair. Most of us have lost our maps, and the tour guide quit 3 years ago, but the view is still quite nice if you don't mind the occasional bit of rain. As if on cue, the sky decided to stop being shy. A soft, gentle rain began to fall, pattering against the roof of the bandstand. It didn't feel cold or intrusive. It felt like the world was washing itself clean, preparing for whatever came next. Alistair reached out, his hand hovering near mine on the bench. He didn't grab it, he just left it there, an invitation. I'm glad I forgot to wash my hands, he said quietly, looking at the blue ink on his thumb. I'm glad I stayed in that cafe even though my coffee was cold and I'd finished my drawing. I was waiting for something. Ellie, I didn't know what it was until you walked through the door and started talking about the sky losing its keys. I looked at his hand, then at mine. My fingers were slightly red from the cold, my nails unpolished. A small scar on my knuckle from a kitchen mishap 3 weeks ago. It was a real hand. Not a character's hand, not a ghost's hand. I slid my hand across the bench until my pinky finger brushed against his. The hedgehog would definitely approve, I whispered. The hedgehog would say it's about time, Alistair replied. We sat there for a long time, watching the rain turn the park into a blurry, impressionist painting. We talked about the mundane things, his job as a landscape architect, my work at the town archives, the way my cat, Barnaby, refused to eat anything that wasn't shaped like a star. We shared the small tragedies, his father's passing, my struggle with a career that felt like a series of dead ends until recently. It was the conversation we should have had 10 years ago, but it was better now. It was richer, like a wine that had been left to age, or a piece of wood that had been smoothed by the tide. We weren't just 2 teenagers hiding behind desks anymore. We were 2 people who had survived the world and found each other again in the debris. What happens now? I asked, as the rain began to taper off. Do we go back to our lives and write notes in the margins of library books? Alistair stood up, offering me his hand. This time, he took mine firmly. His palm was warm and slightly rough. No, he said, his voice steady and full of a quiet kind of hope. I think we leave the notes behind. I think we start writing the main text, together, if you're not too busy being deep, that is. I can pencil you in, I said, my heart doing that Olympic floor routine again. But only if you promise to never write a poem about a digestive biscuit ever again. Deal, he laughed. As we walked out of the park, the clouds finally parted, revealing a sliver of a silver moon. It looked like a fingernail clipping of the gods, another bit of fake philosophy to add to the collection. But as I walked beside Alistair, our hands swinging between us, I realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't need a metaphor to explain how I felt. I just felt happy, and that was deep enough for me. The town of Oakhaven was quiet as we reached the end of the street where our paths would normally diverge. My flat was to the left, past the bakery that always smelled of yeast and secrets. His hotel, the one he was staying at while he finished his project, was to the right, near the old stone bridge. We stopped at the crossroads. The air was still damp, but the world felt remarkably solid. Tomorrow, Alistair asked. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Tomorrow, I agreed. There's a park with a very grumpy statue of a duke who looks like he's smelling something bad. I've always wanted to tell someone about it. "I'd like to meet the Duke," Alistair said. He leaned down and, for a brief, breathless second, his forehead rested against mine. It wasn't a kiss, but it was a promise. "Good night, Ellie, the girl with the mustard life." "Good night, Alistair, the boy with the ink-stained soul." I watched him walk away until he disappeared into the shadows of the bridge. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold, clean air. I reached into my pocket and felt the scrap of paper, the note from the desk. I looked at it one last time under the yellow glow of the street lamp. The sky is just a blue curtain. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't tuck it back into my heart either. I just put it in my pocket and started walking home. As I climbed the stairs to my flat, I thought about the desk. It was probably being broken apart by now. The wood would be splintered, the carvings of hearts and initials reduced to dust. But it didn't matter. The desk wasn't the point. It was just the bridge, and once you've crossed the bridge, you don't need to carry it with you. I opened my door, and Barnaby the cat greeted me with a demanding meow and a flick of his tail. I scooped him up, burying my face in his soft, dusty fur. "He's real, Barnaby," I whispered. "He's not a ghost, and he's coming back tomorrow." Barnaby purred, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to say he'd known it all along. I went to the window and looked out at the night. The stars were out now, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast, dark velvet. They looked like they were waiting for someone to connect them, to draw lines between them and make sense of the chaos. I smiled. Maybe that's all we ever are. Just points of light, waiting for someone to find us and turn us into a constellation. I sat down at my small kitchen table and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. I didn't write about tectonic plates. I didn't write about the sadness of tea. I just wrote a list. 1. Buy more mustard. 2. Wear the yellow ribbon just to be ironic. 3. Ask Alistair what happened to the cat on the bean. I left the pen on the table. The ink was black, not blue, but as I looked at my thumb, I saw a tiny, unmistakable smudge of Alistair's ink where our hands had met. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The next morning, the sun didn't just rise, it announced itself with a flourish of gold and pink, like a royal herald who had finally found his trumpet. I woke up before my alarm, which was a minor miracle in itself. Usually, my alarm and I are in a committed, long-term toxic relationship where I hit snooze until the last possible second of my dignity. But today, the light felt different. It felt like it was inviting me out to play. I spent an unreasonable amount of time choosing an outfit. I wanted to look like myself, but perhaps a slightly more polished version of myself. Not the girl who accidentally wore 2 different socks last Tuesday, but the woman who knew exactly where she was going. I settled on a green jumper the colour of moss and secret gardens and my favourite boots. As I walked to the park to meet Alistair, I found myself looking at the town with new eyes. Oakhaven wasn't just a place I lived, it was a map of stories. There was the shop where I'd bought my first adult book. There was the bench where I'd sat and cried after my first breakup. There was the puddle that always seemed to form in the shape of Australia. I realised that for years, I'd been living in the margins. I'd been so focused on what was missing, the what-ifs and the could-have-beens, that I'd forgotten to look at what was actually there. I saw Alistair from a distance. He was standing by the grumpy statue of the Duke, just as I'd suggested. He was wearing a different coat today, a tan one that made him look like a character from a French film. He was looking at the statue with a focused, slightly amused expression. "You're right," he said as I approached. "He does look like he's just realised he left the oven on. Or like he's just seen the price of a pint in London," I added, stepping up beside him. Alistair turned to me, and the way his face lit up made the morning sun seem a bit redundant. "Hello, Ellie." "Hello, Alistair." We didn't hug, we didn't kiss, we just stood there in the morning light, to people who had found their way back to the same page. "So," he said, gesturing towards the path that led deeper into the park. Where does the story go from here? I looked at him, at the smudge of ink that was still faintly visible on his thumb, and at the wide, open sky above us. I think, I said, we stop worrying about the ending. I think we just enjoy the middle. The middles are the best part anyway. That's where all the action happens. The middle, Alistair repeated, nodding. I like the sound of that. It's much less final than an ending. We started walking, our shoulders brushing as we navigated the gravel path. The world was loud around us, birds singing, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic, but for the first time in a decade, the noise didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like music. And as we disappeared into the trees, I knew that the old school desk was gone, but the bridge it had built was stronger than ever. We weren't hiding anymore. We were out in the light, writing our own story, one smudge of ink at a time. The hedgehog, I was certain, was currently wearing a very dashing top hat and raising a tiny glass of dew in our honour. Life was mustard. It was messy, it was brilliant, and it was just beginning. We walked away from the Duke, whose bronze face seemed to hold a permanent expression of having just been told that the local library was out of digestive biscuits. The gravel of the park path crunched beneath our feet, a rhythmic, grounding sound that felt like the heartbeat of the morning. For a while, we didn't say much. Silence between two people can be a heavy, tectonic thing, full of unsaid apologies and the weight of years, but this silence was different. It was the kind of silence you find in a library at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, hushed, expectant, and smelling faintly of old paper and possibilities. I used to wonder, Alistair said, his voice cutting through the crisp air like a gentle silver blade, if you ever actually existed, not the you who sat 3 rows ahead of me in geography, but the you who wrote about the tectonic plates of the heart, sometimes when the sun hit the desk just right. I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I thought I'd invented a pen pal to keep myself from going mad with the boredom of secondary school. I laughed, a soft sound that felt like it had been trapped in my throat for a decade. I felt the same. There were days when I'd look at the ink on my fingers and think I'd just been doodling nonsense, but then I'd find a note about a cat on a beam, or a drawing of a constellation that didn't exist, and I'd know you were the only thing that felt real in a world made of algebra and soggy school dinners. We reached the edge of the pond, where the ducks were engaged in a very serious, very loud debate about the distribution of crusts. Alistair stopped and leaned against the wooden railing, looking out over the water. The light caught the edges of his hair, turning it into a halo of untidy gold. "Do you think," he asked, his brow furrowing in that way that suggested a deep, pseudo-philosophical thought was about to emerge, "that ducks ever get bored of being ducks? I mean, it's a lot of pressure, isn't it, to always be iconic, to always represent the concept of duckness for everyone who passes by. They never get to be a bit of a heron for a day. Just for a change of pace." I smiled, leaning beside him. This was the Alistair I remembered, the boy who looked at the world through a kaleidoscope and wondered why everyone else was obsessed with plain glass. I think they probably have an existential crisis every time someone throws them a piece of gluten-free bread. It's a lot to process. 1 minute you're a proud waterfowl. The next you're a health-conscious influencer. Alistair chuckled, and for a moment, the years between us seemed to evaporate. We weren't there to something adults with taxes and laundry and complicated histories. We were just 2 points of light, finally finding the line that connected them. "So," I said, poking a loose splinter on the railing. "The middle, you said you liked the sound of it, but what does the middle actually look like, in a story?" "The middle is usually where the hero gets lost in a forest or accidentally marries a goat. It's the bit where everything is a bit of a muddle." Alistair turned his head to look at me, his eyes bright and remarkably clear. "Exactly. The muddle is the point. The beginning is just an introduction, a polite handshake with fate, and the ending, well, the ending is just the part where everyone stops talking." but the middle is where the tea gets brewed. It's where you find out that the person you're walking with prefers their toast slightly burnt, or that they have a secret theory about why the town's clock tower is always 3 minutes slow. It's 3 minutes slow because the ghost of the previous horologist is a bit of a procrastinator, I said immediately. Everyone knows that. See, Alistair grinned. That's a middle fact. You don't get those in the first chapter. We continued our walk, leaving the ducks to their political disputes. We wandered out of the park and into the narrow, winding streets of Oakhaven's old quarter. This was the part of town where the buildings leaned against each other like tired old men sharing a pint. The cobbles were uneven, and the shop windows were filled with things no one actually needed, but everyone secretly wanted: brass telescopes, hand-wear-upon-tea cozies, and jars of sweets that looked like they'd been there since the Great Fire of London. I went to Bristol, Alistair said suddenly, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. To study architecture. I wanted to build things that would last forever, stone and steel, something that couldn't be wiped away with a damp cloth or a change of heart. And did you? I asked. He sighed, a puff of white mist in the cold air. I realized that buildings don't actually last forever. They just take longer to fall down. And the parts that really matter aren't the walls or the roofs. It's the spaces between them. The places where people sit and drink tea, or wait for the bus, or write secrets under desks. I ended up working in restoration, fixing the bits that have been broken by time. It's less about building new worlds and more about being a custodian of the old ones. I thought about my own life, the quiet office, the endless spreadsheets, the way I tucked my dreams into the back of a drawer like a pair of laddered tights. I think I did the opposite. I tried to build walls around myself. I thought if I made everything very tidy and very predictable, I wouldn't get hurt. I became a librarian of my own life, filing everything away under safe and unremarkable. But you're wearing a green jumper, Alistair pointed out, gesturing to my mossy knit. And you have a smudge of black ink on your thumb. That doesn't look like someone who wants to be unremarkable. That looks like someone who's right in the middle of a very interesting chapter. I looked down at my hand. The ink smudge was fading, but it was still there, a tiny, stubborn mark of our connection. I think I'm ready for things to be a bit messy, I admitted. I'm tired of being tidy. We stopped in front of a small cafe called the Crumpets Corner. It was the sort of place that had lace curtains in the windows and a sign that said dogs welcome, people tolerated. The smell of toasted bread and strawberry jam wafted out of the door, wrapping around us like a warm hug. Fancy a cuppa? Alistair asked, and perhaps a crumpet. I feel like the situation requires a high carbohydrate commitment to the middle. I would love a crumpet, I said, but only if it's dripping with so much butter that it's technically a drowning hazard. I wouldn't have it any other way, he replied. Inside, the cafe was a riot of chintz and mismatched crockery. We found a table in the corner, right next to a radiator that was clanking rhythmically, like it was trying to play a very slow percussion solo. A woman with a tower of purple hair and a floral apron appeared with 2 menus that were stuck together with something that might have been honey. "Morning, lovelies," she chirped. "The special today is the Oakhaven Overload. It's a crumpet topped with cheese, ham, and a fried egg that looks like it's seen things it can't explain." "We'll take 2, Alistair said without hesitation, "and a pot of Earl Grey, strong enough to stand a spoon in." As the woman scurried away, Alistair leaned across the table, his eyes darting around the room. "I have a theory about this place," he whispered. "I think the chairs are actually sentient. They only let you sit comfortably if they approve of your conversation topics." I adjusted myself on my seat, which was surprisingly plush. Well, I seem to be doing all right. Maybe the chair likes the duck existentialism talk. Or maybe, Alistair said, his voice softening, it just likes seeing to people who finally stopped running away from their own story. The tea arrived, steaming and fragrant. We poured the milk in silence, watching it swirl into the dark amber liquid like clouds in a storm. It was one of those small, perfect moments that you want to bottle up and keep on a shelf for a rainy day. Do you remember the day it rained during the inter-school sports day? I asked, a memory suddenly surfacing from the depths of my mind. We were all huddled under that tiny marquee, and someone, I think it was Mark Higgins, tried to use a beanbag as a poncho and got stuck. Alistair laughed so hard he nearly knocked his spoon off the table. I remember he looked like a very sad, very shiny beetle, and you were sitting on the grass. Trying to protect your notebook from the puddles, I spent the whole afternoon trying to think of a way to offer you my blazer without looking like a complete berk. You should have, I said, feeling a pang of retrospective regret. I would have loved that blazer. It would have been very cinematic. We could have shared it and looked like a two-headed monster. Next time it rains, Alistair promised, I'll bring a very large coat. We can be the most stylish two-headed monster in Oakhaven. Our Oakhaven overloads arrived, and they were every bit as magnificent and terrifying as promised. We ate with the kind of unself-conscious enthusiasm that only comes when you truly trust the person you're with. There was egg yolk on the table, cheese on our napkins, and a general sense of culinary anarchy. It was, in a word, mustard. You know, I said, wiping a stray bit of ham from my chin, I spent a long time thinking that life had to be a certain way. I thought there was a manual I'd lost in the post, but sitting here, with egg on my face and you across from me, I think the manual is just a collection of blank pages we're supposed to fill with nonsense. Nonsense is the most important thing we have, Alistair agreed, taking a sip of his tea. Without nonsense, we're just machines that eat and sleep. Nonsense is the ink. It's the doodle in the margin that tells you more about the artist than the actual drawing does. He reached into his bag a weathered leather satchel that looked like it had travelled through several centuries and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He flipped through the pages until he found a blank one, then slid it across the table toward me, along with a pen. Write something, he said, not a list of things to buy, not a plan, just something for the middle. I took the pen. It was a heavy, well-balanced thing, the kind of pen that demanded to be used for something significant. I looked at the blank page, the white expanse of it both daunting and inviting. Then I looked at Alistair. He was watching me with an expression of quiet, unwavering patience. I leaned over the paper and began to write. The middle is not a bridge, I wrote, the ink flowing smooth and black. It is the river itself. It is the cold water against your skin, the current that pulls you toward things you didn't know you needed, and the rocks that remind you you're still alive. The middle is where we learn that being lost is just another way of being found. I stopped, my hand hovering over the page. Then I added one more line. P.S. The hedgehog is definitely still wearing the hat. I pushed the notebook back to him. He read it slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. When he looked up, his eyes were shimmering with something that looked suspiciously like tears, though he quickly blinked them away. The river, he murmured. I like that. It's much better than a bridge. Bridges are for crossing. Rivers are for staying in. He tucked the notebook back into his bag, but he kept the pen in his hand, twirling it between his fingers. I have to go to the old chapel on the hill this afternoon. They found some structural issues with the bell tower, and I need to assess the damage. It's a bit of a climb. And the wind up there is enough to blow the thoughts right out of your head. He paused, looking at me expectantly. Would you like to come? We could be custodians of the old world together for a few hours, and I'm fairly certain there's a view from the top that makes Oakhaven look like a toy town. I didn't even have to think about it. The spreadsheets could wait, the laundry could wait, the tidy, unremarkable version of Ellie could stay home and dust the bookshelves. I'd love to, I said, but I should warn you, I'm rubbish at heights. I might have to hold onto your sleeve and make undignified squeaking noises. Squeaking is highly encouraged, Alistair said, standing up and reaching for his coat. In fact, I believe it's a requirement for any successful bell tower expedition. We paid the bill, which involved a fair amount of fumbling with coins and a very confused look from the purple-haired woman when Alistair thanked her for the existential eggs and stepped back out into the street. The sun was higher now, casting long, soft shadows across the cobbles. The air was still cold, but it felt invigorating, like a splash of water to the face. As we walked toward the hill, I felt a strange sense of lightness. It was as if a weight I'd been carrying for years, the weight of waiting, of wondering, of being afraid to start, had simply dissolved. I looked at the town around me, at the familiar shops and the grumpy statues, and I realized that I wasn't just a point of light anymore. I was part of something bigger. I was part of the muddle. We began the climb up the hill, the path winding through a thicket of gnarled oaks and silver birches. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves, a mosaic of copper and gold that crunched under our boots. Alistair led the way, his pace steady and sure, occasionally stopping to point out a particularly interesting moss or a tree that looked like it was trying to do a handstand. "Do you ever think about the school desk?" I asked as we reached a small plateau halfway up. "About who's sitting there now? Do you think they're finding our old ghosts in the wood?" Alistair stopped and looked back at me. "I like to think they are. I like to think that somewhere, right now, a bored teenager is looking at a smudge of ink or a faint scratch and feeling a little less alone. Maybe they're writing their own secrets. Maybe they're building their own bridges. Or their own rivers," I added. "Or their own rivers," he agreed. We reached the chapel, a small, grey stone building that looked like it had grown out of the hillside itself. It was ancient and weathered, with ivy clinging to the walls like a green velvet cloak. The bell tower rose above it, a square, sturdy structure that seemed to defy the wind. Alistair pulled a heavy iron key from his pocket and unlocked the small wooden door at the base of the tower. "After you," he said, gesturing into the darkness. "Mind the first step. It's a bit of a trickster." I stepped inside, the air suddenly cool and smelling of stone and ancient dust. A narrow stone spiral staircase wound its way upward, disappeared into the gloom above. I took a deep breath and began to climb, my heart hammering against my ribs partly from the exertion and partly from the sheer, terrifying brilliance of it all. Alistair followed close behind, his presence a steady warmth in the cramped space. We climbed in silence, the only sound the scraping of our boots and our rhythmic breathing. With every step, the world below seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of us and the cold, grey stone. Finally, we reached the top. We emerged onto a small wooden platform, surrounded by the massive bronze bells and open to the sky on all four sides. Alistair was right, the view was staggering. Oak Haven lay spread out below us like a miniature kingdom, the river a silver ribbon winding through the green and brown of the fields. The wind whipped around us, tugging at our hair and whizzing through the gaps in the stonework. I felt a sudden rush of vertigo and gripped the edge of a wooden beam. Alistair was there in an instant, his hand steadying my arm. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I've got you. Just look at the horizon. Don't look down." I followed his advice, fixing my eyes on the distant line where the grey-blue of the hills met the pale wash of the sky. The world felt vast and wild and beautiful. It felt like anything was possible. "Alistair," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Yes, I don't think I want to go back to being a librarian of my own life." He turned to me, his face inches from mine. The wind was howling around us, but in the center of the tower, it felt strangely still. "Then don't," he said. "The middle is a very big place. Ellie, there's plenty of room for all the mess and all the nonsense you want." He reached out and took my hand. His skin was cold, but his grip was firm and sure. We stood there for a long time, to points of light at the top of the world, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the hills. "Look," Alistair said, pointing toward the town. "You can see the school from here." I squinted, following his finger. There it was, the red brick building, the sprawling playground, the windows reflecting the afternoon light. From this height, it looked small and insignificant, a tiny part of a much larger map. "We started there," I whispered. "We did," Alistair said, "but we're here now, and the view is much better from the middle." As we stood in the bell tower, the wind began to drop, and a profound silence settled over the hills. The world below began to glow with the soft, honeyed light of the golden hour. Everything, the trees, the river, the tiny houses, seemed to be held in a state of grace. I looked at Alistair, and I realized that the secret wasn't in the notes or the desk or the years we'd spent apart. The secret was in the way we were looking at the world now together, with our eyes wide open and our hands covered in ink. "Alistair," I said again. "Yes, Ellie. What happens if the river gets too fast? What if we get swept away?" He smiled, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of that same bright, brave boy who had drawn constellations on a wooden desk. "Then we just swim," he said, "and maybe, if we're lucky, we'll find a very dashy hedgehog with a boat." I laughed, the sound carrying out over the hills, merging with the wind and the light and the infinite, beautiful middle of our story. We weren't just characters in a book anymore. We were the writers, the readers, and the ink itself, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the blank page. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of violet and bruised gold. Below us, the first lights of Oakhaven began to flicker on, one by one, like stars falling to earth. They were points of light, waiting for someone to find them. And as we began the long descent back down the spiral stairs, I knew that whatever happened next, whether it was rain or sun, mustard or honey, we would find our way, we would keep writing. We would keep swimming, and we would always, always remember to look for the hat on the hedgehog. The middle was, quite frankly, the most magnificent place I'd ever been. The spiral stairs felt less like a descent and more like a gentle unspooling of a ribbon that had been wound too tight for 15 years. Each step down was a layer of old dust shed from my heart, a rhythmic thud tap that echoed against the damp, moss-slick stone. Alistair went first this time, his broad shoulders occasionally brushing the walls. He walked with a newfound lightness, as if the gravity of the bell tower had stayed behind to keep the bells company, leaving him buoyant. "You know, Ellie," he said, his voice bouncing upwards to meet me. "The problem with the world is that we're all obsessed with the ground floor. We think the lobby is where the truth is because that's where the post arrives. But truth is actually a bird. It doesn't care about letterboxes." I smiled at his back, my hand trailing along the cold masonry. "And what does this bird truth do, Alistair? Does it just sit on weather vanes and judge us for our choice of hats?" "No," he replied, pausing on a narrow landing where a single slit of a window allowed a sliver of violet dusk to pierce the gloom. "It waits for us to stop being so vertically challenged in our thinking. We spend our lives looking at our shoes to make sure we don't trip. But the best things, the really, truly magnificent bits of nonsense are usually happening just above our eyebrows." He turned to look at me, his face half hidden in the shadows of the stone archway. The pseudo-philosophy was classic Alistair, a mixture of profound insight and complete, lovable gibberish. It was the kind of wisdom that sounded like it belonged in a leather-bound book, but had actually been found at the bottom of a cereal box. And yet, it felt more real than any of the sensible adulting guidelines I'd tried to live by since leaving Oakhaven. We reached the heavy oak door at the base of the tower. Alistair pulled it open with a groan of protesting hinges, and we stepped out into the crisp evening air of the churchyard. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke greeted us, that peculiar British scent of a day settling down for a long sleep. Oakhaven was beginning to twinkle. The street lamps along the high street hummed to life, casting amber pools onto the cobblestones. "Hungry?" Alistair asked, tucked his hands into his pockets. I feel like a man who has successfully climbed a mountain and deserves at least 3 different types of potato. "I think I could eat an entire bakery," I admitted, my stomach letting out a small, treasonous growl. "But only if there's tea. My soul is currently about 60% caffeine depleted." We walk side by side through the churchyard, dodging the lopsided gravestones that looked like rows of crooked teeth. We didn't head toward the modern part of town with its sleek glass fronts and neon signs. Instead, we drifted instinctively toward the old quarter, where the buildings leaned against each other like tired friends and the windows were small and wavy-paned. "Do you remember the crumbling crust?" I asked, pointing toward a narrow alleyway. Alistair winced playfully. "The place where the lady used to give us extra jam because she thought we looked pithy, yes. I'm still not entirely sure what she meant by pithy. But the jam was excellent. I suspect it was mostly sugar and optimism." "We were pithy," I insisted, laughing. "We were full of pith. We had so much pith we didn't know what to do with it." As we walked, the conversation meandered like the river oak itself. We talked about the years in between the dull offices, the accidental careers, the people we'd met who were perfectly nice, but rather like unbuttered toast. We spoke of the mistakes we'd made, not with regret, but with a sort of bewildered affection. I told him about the time I'd tried to learn the cello and ended up scaring the neighbor's cat so badly it moved to another county. He told me about a disastrous attempt to bake a sourdough loaf that became so hard he'd used it as a doorstop for 3 months. "It's okay to be a bit rubbish at things, isn't it?" Alistair mused as we passed the red brick facade of our old primary school. "Society wants us to be these shiny, finished products, like a brand new kettle, but I think I'd rather be a slightly dented teapot, one that leaks a bit, but makes a cracking brew if you know how to hold the handle." I looked at the school gates, the iron bars cold and black in the twilight. "I spent so long trying to be the kettle, Alistair. I thought if I didn't have all the answers, I was failing the exam. But there is no exam, is there?" "If there is, I've definitely lost my pencil," he said, stopping by the gate. He reached out and touched the brickwork, where a faint, scratched set of initials, not ours, but someone's, still lingered. "The secret to life," Ellie, "is realizing that the universe is just one big, messy craft project. We're all just bits of glitter and glue trying to stick to something meaningful." We stood there for a moment, the silence of the schoolyard heavy with the ghosts of children's laughter and the phantom scent of floor wax. I realized then that being grown up wasn't about having a clear map. It was about being brave enough to wander into the woods with someone who didn't mind if you got mud on your boots. "Look at us," I whispered, to adults standing outside a school at 7 in the evening, talking about glitter. "We're officially eccentric." "It's a noble calling," Alistair declared, puffing out his chest. "Next, we'll start wearing mismatched socks on purpose and writing letters to the local paper about the lack of quality clouds. It'll be marvelous." We turned away from the school and headed toward a small, glowing pub nestled at the end of the street, the Thirsty Bishop. The sign swung gently in the breeze, depicting a very jolly-looking clergyman holding a tankard. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted hops, vinegar, and the low murmur of local gossip. We found a tiny table in the corner, tucked away behind a pillar carved with strange, wooden fruit. The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing orange light across Alistair's face. He looked different here, less like a memory and more like a permanent fixture of my future. "To the middle," Alistair said, raising a glass of dark ale once we'd ordered. "To the middle," I echoed, clinking my glass of ginger beer against his, "and to the hedgehogs." Especially the ones with boats, he added solemnly. As we ate, yes, there were 3 types of potato. I felt a strange, shimmering sensation in my chest. It wasn't just the warmth of the fire or the comfort of the food. It was the realization that the notes under the desk hadn't been a message from the past, they had been a bridge. We hadn't been waiting for the happily ever after, because that was a finish line, and finish lines are boring. We were right in the thick of the once upon a time, where the ink was still wet and anything could happen. Alistair, I said, leaning across the table. He replied, midship. What was the very last thing you wrote? Not in the desk, but in your head, before we left school. He swallowed, his expression softening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, the one he'd been carrying since we met at the station. He smoothed it out on the table. It wasn't a new note, it was a drawing. It was a sketch of 2 small figures standing on a very tall tower, looking at a horizon that went on forever. Underneath, in his messy, looping scrawl, were the words, "Don't worry about the ending. The best bits are the scribbles in the margins." I felt a lump in my throat, a sweet, aching sort of happiness. I reached out and put my hand over his. I like the scribbles, I said. Me too, he whispered. They're much more interesting than the straight lines. Outside, the Oakhaven sky had turned a deep, velvety indigo. The stars were beginning to peek through the clouds, tiny pinpricks of light that looked suspiciously like the constellations we'd once drawn on a wooden desk. The world was vast, confusing, and occasionally prone to rain, but as I sat there in the glow of the pub fire, I knew one thing for certain. The story wasn't over, it was just getting to the part where the characters finally stop checking the page numbers and start enjoying the font, and frankly, the font was looking quite lovely tonight. The fire in the hearth of the thirsty bishop gave a sudden, theatrical pop, sending a shower of sparks dancing against the soot-stained brickwork. It was a sound that belonged in a storybook, the kind of punctuation mark the universe provides when it's feeling particularly smug about a plot twist. I looked from the fire to Alistair, then down at the 3 types of potato on my plate, mashed, roasted, and a rather defiant pile of thick-cut chips. It was an embarrassment of carbohydrates, a culinary rebellion against the very idea of restraint. You know, Alistair said, poking a roasted potato with his fork as if it were a rare specimen of beetle. There's a profound lesson in the potato. It doesn't try to be a carrot. It doesn't pine for the elegance of asparagus. It's just a lumpy, earth-covered tuber that accepts its fate. Whether that's being drowned in gravy or turned into a crisp, we should all be more like potatoes. Ellie, rounder, sturdier, and significantly less prone to existential dread. I laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place that had felt quite hollow only a few hours ago. I think I'm already halfway there on the round front, especially after this meal. But honestly, Alistair, if we were potatoes, we'd still be the ones worrying if we were in the right kind of sack. He grinned, that lopsided, boyish expression that made the years between us vanish like mist on the Oakhaven fens. True, we'd be the potatoes writing frantic notes to the parsnips about the meaning of the vegetable drawer. We lapsed into a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with cleverness. Around us, the pub was a symphony of small, human noises. There was the rhythmic thud of the dartboard in the far corner, the clink of glasses at the bar, and the low, rolling rumble of the locals discussing the scandalous price of sheep dip or the unfortunate state of the parish council's flower beds. It was a world that felt solid and unshakable, a stark contrast to the shifting, ghost-haunted corridors of the school we'd just left. I reached out and traced the edge of Alistair's drawing the 2 figures on the tower. The paper was soft, nearly translucent from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. It struck me then that this wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a relic. It was a survivor of all the versions of Alistair that had existed since he was 17. Why did you keep it? I asked softly. All this time, through university, through jobs, through everything. Why this specific scribble? Alistair leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling beams, which were festooned with dried hops and old pewter tankards. Because it was the only thing I ever got right, he said, his voice dropping to a register that felt like a secret. In school, I was always trying to find the correct answer. I thought if I could just memorize the right dates or solve the right equations, the world would suddenly click into place like a Lego set. But that drawing, I did it during a double period of geography while Mr. Henderson was droning on about Oxbow Lakes. I wasn't trying to be right. I was just trying to be US. He looked back at me, his eyes bright in the firelight. I kept it to remind myself that the correct life is a myth. The real stuff, the stuff that actually stays with you, is the nonsense you create when you're not paying attention to the lesson. The scribbles in the margins, I whispered, repeating his words. Exactly, he said, tapping the paper. Everyone focuses on the main text. They want the bold headings and the bullet points. But have you ever noticed that the best notes in a library book are always the ones scrolled in the edges? This bit is rubbish. Or I loved her here. That's where the soul lives, in the messy bits that weren't supposed to be there. I felt a strange, fluttering sensation in my chest, as if a trapped bird had finally found an open window. All my life, I had been trying to write my story in a straight line, with perfect margins and no ink blots. I had treated my career, my relationships, and even my grief like a series of exams I had to pass. But sitting here with Alistair, in a pub that smelled of vinegar and old wood, I realized that my life was actually a glorious, sprawling mess of doodles. And for the first time, I wasn't ashamed of the smudges. I think I said, my voice trembling slightly with a mixture of laughter and tears, that I've spent far too much time worrying about the font size of my destiny. I forgot to actually read the words. Alistair reached across the table and squeezed my hand. His skin was warm, a solid reality in a world of memories. Well, the good news is that we're currently in chapter 20-something. And the plot has just taken a very interesting turn involving a thirsty bishop and an excessive amount of starch. I'd say the font is looking rather magnificent. We finished our meal, arguing light-heartedly over who would get the last chip he won, but only because he claimed it looked like the Isle of Wight and eventually stepped out into the night. O'Cavan at night was a different creature than it was by day. The shadows of the ancient stone cottages stretched across the cobbled streets, and the air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes you tuck your chin into your scarf and appreciate the invention of wool, but neither of us wanted to rush. We walked slowly, our footsteps echoing in the quiet village. We passed the old bakery, its windows dark now, and the small green where a solitary oak tree stood like a silent sentinel. "Do you remember the time we tried to climb that tree?" Alistair asked, pointing toward the oak. "You told me there was a portal to another dimension in the upper branches." I was very convincing, I defended, and in my defense, I was 8. The world was much more likely to have portals back then. Now it just has Wi-Fi dead zones. I got stuck halfway up, Alistair recalled, chuckling. I was terrified. I thought I'd have to live there forever, surviving on acorns and the occasional stolen sandwich. And you sat at the bottom and read me your Enid Blyton book until the caretaker came with a ladder. You didn't even laugh at me. I was waiting until you were down, I corrected. It's bad form to mock someone while they're at risk of a gravitational incident. I laughed plenty once you were on solid ground. You did. You laughed until you turned purple. It was very touching. We reached the top of the hill, where the village dipped down toward the railway station. From here, we could see the lights of the distant town, a shimmering amber carpet laid out against the dark velvet of the countryside. The world felt enormous, yet strangely intimate. "Alistair," I said, stopping by a low stone wall, "what happens tomorrow, when the train comes and the Once Upon a Time has to deal with Monday morning?" He hopped up onto the wall, swinging his legs like a schoolboy. He looked out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful. Well, scientifically speaking, Monday is just Sunday's way of being grumpy. But philosophically, I think tomorrow is just another margin, another place to scribble. He turned to me, his face softening. I don't want to go back to being a memory, Ellie, and I don't want you to be a ghost in a school desk. I think we should stop looking for the notes we left behind and start writing new ones, not under desks. Though, maybe on the backs of receipts, or in the steam on the bathroom mirror, or, I don't know, via very long, rambling text messages about the clouds. I climbed up onto the wall beside him, our shoulders brushing. The cold air nipped at my cheeks, but I felt a glowing warmth radiating from my heart. I'd like that, I said. I'm quite good at rambling. I have ADHD in it. I know, he whispered, it's one of your best features. We sat there for a long time, two adults perched on a wall in the middle of a sleeping village, watching the stars. I thought about the girl who had hidden her heart in the notch of a wooden desk, and the boy who had been too afraid to tell her he was lost too. We weren't those people anymore. We were older, slower, and perhaps a bit more bruised by the world, but we were also braver. We had survived the ending of our childhood, and here we were, still standing, still scribbling. The universe, I decided, wasn't a cold, vast vacuum. It was a giant, messy, wonderful sketchbook. And while we might not be the main characters in a grand epic, we were the authors of our own delightful nonsense. Look, Alistair said, pointing upward, a shooting star. Did you make a wish? I asked. No, he replied, a small, secret smile playing on his lips. I don't need to. I think I've finally figured out the answer to that geography question. Which one? The one about where the river goes, he said, looking at me. It doesn't matter where it ends. Ellie, the best part is the way it bends. The way it gets caught in the reeds and makes a bit of a fuss before it moves on. I think I'm quite happy just being in the bend. I leaned my head on his shoulder, the wool of his coat rough against my temple. Me too, Alistair, me too. The night deepened, the indigo sky turning a rich, obsidian black. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, a lonely, haunting sound that echoed through the valley. But we didn't move. We stayed right there in the middle of our story, perfectly content with the smudges, the scribbles, and the beautiful, irregular font of a life lived in the margins. The notes under the desk were gone, replaced by the reality of a hand held in the dark. And as the wind whispered through the Oakhaven oaks, I knew that even if the ink faded, the story would remain not because it was written in stone, but because it was written in us. And frankly, it was a much better read than I ever expected.